Today I'm going to show you how to draft the Maisie dress. The instructions can be downloaded for free from the Pattern Union website. Just make sure that you copy and paste the discount code and enter that at the checkout to get it for nothing. So I'm going to show you just how to hack it up a little bit and have some fun with the sewing. Let's get on with it. So here are the instructions that I've printed out on my printer. You'll have to excuse the colours, my printer's playing up a little bit at the moment and everything's coming out green, but for the purposes of this it doesn't matter. So what I thought I would do is the maxi dress, but I want to give it a bit more of a boho feel, so I'm actually going to create some layers. So what I'm going to do is have one first layer and then another longer layer and then just a short one, and then these two bottom layers are going to have a slight ruffle, and I'm going to put a lace insert through just above where the ruffle's going to go. I'm also going to put a lace insert or two down the front, and I'm going to use a white cheesecloth because I think that really works well with the boho feel. I will still do the channel so that I end up with gathering so it looks like the long version of the boho dress, but it'll look great worn with a belt as well. To start with, I need some measurements. So I'm going to base this on my measurements, and when you do it, you need to base it on your measurements. So the first thing that we need to know is our hip plus 6 centimetres. So that's 6 centimetres is ease. So my hips are 102 centimetres plus 6 centimetres equals 108 centimetres. Next, I need to work out my sleeve width. So it's my bicep plus 20 centimetres. So my bicep is 28 centimetres, and then I have plus 20 equals 48 centimetres. So that's nice and loose. For my skirt length, I'm actually dividing the skirt into portions, as I said. So this first portion will measure 30 centimetres. The second portion will measure 45 centimetres, and the third portion is going to measure 25 centimetres, and that's allowing a bit of a fold over for my flounce, so that actually the final measurement will be 90 centimetres. So we're going to start with the top, and I'm just going to draw that onto a piece of paper. So I'll just move those out of the way for the moment. The first thing I'm going to do is create a centre balance line. Now, I could use the edge of the paper, but I like to give myself space and room. So I'm actually just going to use my ruler and line that up with the edge of the paper and draw a balance line that's parallel with the edge of the paper, but it just gives me a bit of space. The next thing I'm going to do is square across like so. So this is going to be my centre line, either for the centre back or the centre front, and this top line is my shoulder. So what we need to do is measure down 52 centimetres. So I've got a slightly longer ruler here, and I'm going to mark 52 on this balance line, and then I'm going to come across on the shoulder line and measure 52 so that I can square across evenly. That didn't seem very accurate. But it is. And draw a line. So the instructions tell us to come down 52, and then we need this hip plus 6 measurement divided by 4. So my hip measurement plus 6 was 108, and I need to now divide that by 4. So I'll just use my calculator. 108 divided by 4 equals 27. So I need to come across the top 27 centimetres. and I'll draw that in. So 27 on the top, 27 on the bottom, and then join those two lines. Next, I'm going to do the sleeve portion. So that says come across 8 centimeters. I'm going to measure across 8 and then just come down a little bit and measure out 8 to give myself a line. And then the instruction here says it's the bicep plus 20 divided by 2. So my bicep measurement plus 20 was 48, divided by 2 equals 24. So I need to come down 24 centimeters for that sleeve. So I'm going to measure down 24, mark it with a dash, come across, measure down 24, mark it with a dash, and square across. So now I need to do the skirt portion. So that's not going to fit on my piece of paper, so I'm just going to flip that over and do that on this side. So again, I'm going to draw a balance line straight down, like so, squaring across the top, like so. Now, we can come back to these instructions. So my measurement for the top of the skirt, same as the top, was 27. So I'm going to measure across 27, mark it with a dash, come down away and mark 27 and join that line together. If I was following these instructions and just had one tier for the skirt, I would come down 90 centimeters, but I want my first portion to measure 30 centimeters. So I'm just going to measure down 30 centimeters, mark that with a dash, and come down here 30 centimeters and mark that with a dash. So this will be, again, a center line. So the center back or the center front, this is my waist, and this is where the next tier will join on to. So the other things that we have left to draft are the waist ties and the waist placket. Your waist ties can be as long as you want. I just use the width of the material by 2 centimeters, and we'd like them nice and long so we can draw them and have them sort of flowing, so I like to do 2 times the width. For the waist placket, that needs to measure the same as the pattern, so that's going to be the hip plus 6 by 4 centimeters. So in my case it's 4 centimeters by 108. And that will be my pattern piece. So I can also draw that on here. And 108 centimeters is longer than my paper, so I'm actually going to do that in half and just do this on the fold, which will make it easy. So I can draw from that top balance line a line that's going to be 108 divided by 2, which is 54 centimeters. So mark 54 by 4 centimeters, so measuring across 4, mark that with a dash, across 4, mark that with a dash, and draw in that line. So this is going to be my waist placket. And I'm going to cut it out on the fold. The ties I'm going to leave till last. I don't really need a pattern for them, and you'll see why. Now we go to page 3. So I'm going to turn my paper over again, and we're going to start with the top. So the instructions say to come across 14 centimetres on the neck. So I'm going to measure out from the centre, 14 centimetres, and mark that with a dash. And we'll start with the back. So the back, we come down the centre line, 3 centimetres, and I just like to square out a little way with a short line. Then I'm going to take a French curve to draw in my neck curve. So there are different kinds of French curves you can get. This is a proper sewing one, and it will come in centimetres or inches. And this one is just from an office supplies shop. You can see they're different shape curves, and all of them are good. For me, they have different purposes. So I'm just going to draw in that back neck curve using my French ruler, and then I'm going to draw in my front neck curve. So that says come down 8 centimetres. So measuring down 8, mark it with a dash, square out a little way, and then draw that front neck curve like so. So I've got my back neck curve and my front neck curve. The next thing it tells us to do is blend under the arms, because that at the moment is a sharp angle and we want to be able to sew that easily in one fluid motion. So what you need to do is just sort of play around with your French curve until you get a shape that you like. So I'm balancing points of the curve on those straight lines, and then I just draw in the curve like so. I don't want to come too close to this edge because I want to be able to hem it, so it needs to be straight through here. But I could soften that curve too. So if I now use this curve and draw that line in, I can look at the two and see which one I prefer. And actually I prefer that second line. So I'm just going to erase the first one. And then my top is ready to trace off. So let's do the skirt. So it goes to one side. Flip that over. If I was doing the skirt in its longer length, or it would just be the single portion, I would actually look at the width of my fabric, then divide that by 4, and then that would just be the hem of my skirt, and I would bring that up to the side seam to create just a gentle flare. But in my case, because I'm going to add tiers, I actually don't need to change this at all. So there is no change for my skirt. So now I'm ready to trace off my pattern pieces. So I've come back to the front and I'm going to trace that off. So I like to trace my patterns onto Vilene. I think this is a great way of keeping your patterns. It's fantastic because it doesn't crease, it doesn't tear, and it kind of sticks to material like it's magnetic. So for me, I find it perfect. So what I'm going to do is line up the edge of the Vilene with my centre front, because I don't have a seam on that centre front. So to stop it from moving, I'm just going to use a couple of paper weights that I got from an office supplies shop. When you're drawing on Vilene, pencils don't work very well, but biros are great, or a ballpoint pen. So to start with, I'm just going to trace around the front, and I like to just draw all my straight lines first, and then go back and do the curves. So drawing in that underarm curve. And drawing in the neckline curve. So I'm actually going to change the shape of that a little bit, like so. Now, these drafting instructions don't include seam allowance, so now we need to add our seam allowance. I like to use 1 centimetre, and it just so happens that on my ruler, if I measure from the edge of the ruler to the bottom of the number, it is exactly 1 centimetre. So my trick is to line up the bottom of the numbers with the line that I have drawn and just draw a line across, and that is my perfect 1 centimetre. Again, I'm just going to do all my straight lines first, and then come back in and do the curves. So for my curved neckline, I've drawn in the 1 centimetre at the straight portion, and I'm just going to draw in 1 centimetre at the shoulder neck point, and then I can just use my French curve and tee those two lines up together, and I just eyeball it to see that that is in fact 1 centimetre. That works really well for me, but that could be because I've got a few years of practice behind me. But I'm going to do the same here on this underarm. So the straight portion, I've added my seam allowance, same with the side seam, and then I'm just going to come over with my French curve, line up those 2 points and draw in my side seam. And if I do measure it, I can see that, yep, that's 1 centimetre. So, you know, practice trusting yourself. Now I'm going to trace off the back. And there I have my back and front pieces traced off. Now I'm going to cut them out. Here is my back and front cut out. Now what we need to do is what's called truing the seams. So you just want to check that your side seams do in fact match, and your shoulder seams, and then what we want to do is look at this neckline. So these measurements for the neckline are a suggestion only. This is a pull-on garment, so it needs to be able to get over your head. But if you prefer to have a lower neckline, then by all means you can do that. If you want to bring in the shoulder as well, you can do that too, so long as you can pull it over your head. But to true the neckline, we're going to fold the front over the back and line it up along the actual stitching line, not the seam allowance line. And that's the great thing about the violin too, is that because you can see through it, you can see exactly where your stitching line is. Now if you have a look, I have quite a point here on my shoulder neck point, so that would be really difficult to sew. So what I need to do is actually take my French curve, so just lining those up, I pop a weight on there to stop them moving, and I'm going to open out this curve so I can play around with my French curves and sort of see how that will look better. So I'm just going to bring that shape around a bit and do more of a curve like so, and then the same with the back. I'm just going to actually straighten that a little bit before I go into the curve. Like so. And then I just need to rejig my seam allowance so that it fits nicely with those new lines that I've drawn. So if I cut that out, oops. So it's not much. I've only cut off those two small portions, but that is going to make all the difference when I come to sew my neckline, because I have a smoother curve through that neck shoulder point. Now I'm going to trace off the first tier of the skirt. So here I have my center line, and that is going to be either my center front or my center back, and drawing the bottom and the waist and the side seam. Then I'm going to add my seam allowance. So just as I did before, using my ruler as a guide, lining up the edge of the numbers. So just check your ruler, that might work for you as well, like so. So that is 1/4 of the body. So I'm just going to take my Vilene, fold it in half along that center line, pop a weight on, and rather than redrawing it, I'm just going to cut that out. If I open that out, I have the first tier for my skirt. So I need two because I have one for the front and one for the back. So I'm just going to cut the other one out exactly the same way. Lastly, I'm going to cut out my waist placket. So lining up my Vilene, I've got a nice straight edge here, and I'm just going to line that up so it's nice and parallel. Now I'm going to trace around the waist placket. So the waist placket has an opening at the center front so that you can thread elastic through, which is why I can do it on the fold. But I still need to add seam allowance, so not where I've got the fold, but for the rest of it I do. And you know, this waist placket can vary depending on the width of your elastic as well. It's just a suggestion. So there is my waist placket with that end on the fold, and I'm just going to cut that out. So in my stash I've got this really pretty lace, so I thought it would be fun to do a bit of lace insertion into this design. So as I drew on my picture, I thought it'd be nice to have 2 rows down the front. So I'm going to take my front pattern piece and just sort of line up the lace to see where it would look nice. So I think sort of if I've got 2 rows, have a bit of fabric on the center front and have that in that position, that looks good. So I'm just going to measure how much that is. So that's about 3 centimeters. So I'm going to draw a line on here that's 3 centimeters in, and draw a line all the way down. Next, I need to look at how wide my lace is. So when I sew it on, I'm going to need a seam allowance in here. So I could sort of line that up like that, but let's do this properly with measurements. So my lace inside that little scalloped edge measures 5 centimeters. So if I measure across 5 centimeters here, I can see where my lace would go. I'll just get the longer ruler. Okay, so that's where my lace will sit. So if I sew that in, and I don't want to have fabric behind it, I need to actually cut that portion out, but obviously I'm going to be sewing it onto the lace, so I need a seam allowance. So now I'm going to draw on my seam allowance. So adding a centimetre to the front, so this is my centre front and this will be my side front, and I'm going to add a centimetre to the side front as well. So this whole portion here needs to be removed because I'm going to fill it in with the lace. So if I cut this out, like so, and then cut out the portion I'm removing, like so, and throw that away. What you can see is if I take my piece of lace, getting all tangled here, that would be sewn to there, and that's going to go underneath there for my insertion. So now we need to label all our pattern pieces so we don't get confused. So this is the centre front, and this is going to be on the fold. So it's on the fold, and I need to cut ×1 on the fold. My side front, I need to cut ×1 pair because now it has a seam. For my back, this is on the fold, and so for this I will cut, so label that back and that side front, and this is cut ×1 on fold. For my placket, we've already established that there is a fold, so we can label this placket, and we cut ×1. For our back and front skirt portions, just move that out of the way, so we've got the two for the first tier, so we can label this skirt tier 1, cut ×1, so this is the front. This one will be the back, skirt tier 1, cut ×1, like so. I could also just have had one pattern piece and cut it out as a pair. And you can see also I have my centre line, and you can mark those with notches so that you can easily pin the pieces to the top. So my calculation for tier 2 is 27 times 1.7. So 27 times 1.7 equals 45.9. So I'm just going to round that to 46 centimetres. So that means that the width through 1/4 is 46 centimetres. So my whole measurement will be 46 times 2. So 46 times 2 is 92. So the length of tier 2 is going to be 92 by that depth of 45, and I need to cut times 1 pair. So I could cut a pattern piece out for that, but given that it's just a rectangle, I'm just going to cut out 2 rectangles exactly the same size. For tier 3, I'm going to actually keep it the same width. I just sort of want this to look like a little flouncy thing without adding extra volume to my skirt. So that will also be 92 centimetres, but this time by 25. Now I'm ready to cut out my pattern pieces. So here's my fabric. It's just a beautiful lightweight cheesecloth, but it only measures 100 centimetres wide. So on my pattern, I've said that tier 2 needs to measure 92 centimetres. Well, this measures 100 centimetres, so really that 8 centimetres less seam allowance doesn't make that much difference when I'm gathering something. So I'm just actually going to go with the width of my fabric. So the first tier we have a pattern piece for, and I'll cut that out after, but while I've got this nice straight edge, I'm just going to do tier 2 and tier 3. So tier 2 measures 45 centimetres. So I like to tear my fabric when I'm getting a straight line, because that means that it's properly on the grain line. But always do this on a test piece first, just to see if your material will tear, because not all of them do. So what I do is measure up my 45 centimetres, do a snip and tear that over to the other selvage, and then I just snip through. I find this so satisfying. I love tearing fabric. I'm going to take the other half, so 45 centimetres, snip, tearing across, and cut that off and pop that to one side. Now I can do tier 3, which is 25 centimetres long, so measuring 25, doing a snip, tear it across, and cut through, and one more, so that I have a pair for tier 2 and a pair for tier 3. Much easier than making a pattern piece. Now the other thing I mentioned to you earlier was the ties. So the ties measure 2 centimetres by the fabric width, and we need 2 of them to join together to make it long enough to create a nice tie. So the tie being 2 centimetres plus my seam allowance, in my case a centimetre each side, is 4 centimetres. So I'm just going to do 2 snips that are 4 centimetres wide, and I can tear those off for my drawstring ties and join them together. Now, did you notice how I didn't actually cut through that middle one? And that's because I can then join those together, and it just keeps them together. Nice little tip there for keeping track of your ties. So now I'm going to lay out the rest of my pattern pieces. Here I have my pattern pieces all laid out. So I have folded my fabric in half, got the fold along here. So the centre back is on the fold. I've got the centre front on the fold, and then the side front next to it, and then the back and front tiers of the top of the skirt. I've got my placket here. Now it says it's on the fold. If I try and put my placket on the fold this way, it doesn't fit very economically. So for me, I'm actually going to cut it out of this bit of wastage that I have along the side. And that's the kind of thing that you can do. You know, work with your fabric, see what you think is best for your design. So I'm going to cut that out. So here I have all my pattern pieces cut out. What you need to do is mark all your center notches. So I just do little snips on the corner. Make sure though that you keep them very small, because if you've only got a centimetre seam allowance, you need to have your snips that are smaller than your seam allowance. So I'm just going to go through marking all those centre snips. And that's done. Now what you'll notice maybe is that I didn't use any pins when I was cutting out. I just used these paper weights, because if I even take that off, if I swish my hand around, see how the pattern pieces are hardly moving? And that's what's so great about the Vilene, is that it actually just kind of sticks to the material, and if you use less pins, it's quicker. And if it's quicker, well, for me, that's more fun. So let's get this sewn up. The first thing I'm going to sew is the lace inserts in the front top. So here I have my centre front piece, and I'm just going to overlock on both sides. Snip those threads, and next I'm going to overlock the fronts of the side front. Technique I like to use is topping and tailing, so I sew down one side, chaining on, and then back up the other. Snip those threads, and because I chained on, I just snip the threads, and I don't have very much thread wastage. I'm going to start with the centre front, and I just want to show you that this lace has quite a distinctive pattern. So on one side it's got a straight edge, the other side is scalloped, and also there is this flower pattern. So it was important that I made sure that I've got good pattern matching. So if I sewed it this way up, the pattern matching is correct, whereas if I flipped it over, it's actually a little bit out. So I'm just going to mark the top of each with a pin so I don't forget. Now I'm going to sew this lace to the centre front, and I have made it a little bit longer so that I have a little bit to play with at each end, which is useful to me. So I'm going to sew it on with a zigzag. So I'm going to set my machine to 2.5 and 2.5 for the stitch length, and I'm just going to sew on the edge of the lace, but I'm overlapping 1 centimetre because I have allowed a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Take that out, and now I'm going to sew up the other way, making sure that my tops are matched, and just checking that my pattern matching of the lace is the same on both sides. Take that out and snip the threads And that's looking really pretty. With it sewn like this, I can actually see the seam allowance. So what I want to do is have the seam allowance folding away from the lace so that the lace becomes a real feature. So I'm going to set my machine back to a straight stitch, and I'm going to fold that seam allowance back on itself. And I'm just going to edge stitch that seam allowance down. Snip the threads. Okay, so now I've edge stitched that seam allowance back on itself, and I think that looks gorgeous. Now I'm going to sew the lace to the side fronts. So because I've got this little scalloped edge, I'm actually not going to try and follow that. I'm just going to sew in a bit as a straight line with my zigzag, and then that little scallop can lift a bit, but I think that'll look really pretty. I've made my lace slightly longer than my centre front piece because the neck actually shapes up on the side front. So what I'm going to do is actually sew from the hem so that I know that that's completely straight, and then when the lace finishes up the top it can sit where it needs to, and then I'll just reshape the curve of the neckline. So I'm setting my machine to 2.5 and 2.5 for the zigzag stitch. That's sewn on. Now I'm going to do the same to the other side. And this time I'm going to sew from the top down to the bottom. So I'm going to place the lace on top, again looking for the pattern matching so that it's going to look completely symmetrical. And I'll just pop a pin in there just to hold it in place while I put that under the machine. Cut those threads. Now again I'm going to fold the seam allowance back on itself and stitch it with a straight stitch. So I'm going to keep it on 2.5, folding my seam allowance out of the way, and sew down that side. How pretty does that look? Now I'm just going to fold this front piece in half, and I'm going to line up the two necklines, or the two halves of the neckline, like so, and I'm just going to trim that off. I could place my pattern piece on top, but it's only a small bit, and I just trim off so I get that nice little curve, and I'm just going to give that a press. Now I'm ready to sew my shoulder seam, so I'm going to open out the front right side up and place the back on top, right sides together, and I'm going to sew along both shoulder seams. So this is only a short seam, so I don't really need to use any pins. This is very stable material. Maybe if I was using something slippery like a satin I might pin it, but it's just straight. going to chain on, because that's what I like to do. Can snip the join at the neck, and now I am ready to overlock this seam, and then I'm going to press it towards the back. I'm overlocking on the front because then when I press the seam towards the back, the top of the overlocking is uppermost, and that's the sort of most attractive side, but you don't have to do that, it's just an aesthetic thing. Snip those threads. I'm going to give that a press, and then I'm ready to do the neckline. To finish off the neckline, I'm going to use a bias binding finish. Now you could either use bought bias binding or make your own. I've made my own here from some scraps that I had left over, because I think actually that's just going to look really nice, and I've drawn my lines using an erasable pen, so I have checked first to make sure that those lines will disappear. So I'm going to start from the centre back, right side is up. I'm going to fold over 1 centimetre of the bias binding, and I'm going to pin that on the centre back neck. Now I'm just going to sew all the way around the neck, and when I get back to the centre back I'm going to overlap by 1 centimetre and then trim off the excess of my bias binding. It's also a good idea to make sure if you've got a join in your bias binding that you actually do have right sides together. It can be tricky to tell in a fabric such as this. There we go, pinning that centre back. So I'm putting it under my machine. Start off with a little back tack and sew all the way around. When you get to that shoulder, you just need to sort of flatten out your top and just mould the bias binding around that curve. And because we trued the pattern, we know that that's going to sit very nicely. If you have a fabric like cheesecloth, which has a crinkle in it, you want to be careful that you don't stretch the body of the top as you're sewing, because that will just make the crinkles stretch out and the whole thing grow. Okay, so I'm coming up to the end. I'm just going to cut my bias binding so that I've got a nice little overlap, and finish off my seam with back tacking. And take that out. And trim those threads. Next, I'm going to edge stitch the bias binding. So I'm going to fold the bias binding over the seam allowance, and I'm just going to edge stitch about 2 millimeters away from the fold, and I'm pulling the material of the bodice and the bias binding sideways, not back and front, to ensure that I don't get any rolling on that seam. Back to the end, back tacking, take it out and trim your threads. Next, I'm going to trim back that seam allowance. I like to use duck-billed scissors because they can help prevent cutting through all the layers and make trimming a seam very easy. The way I do it is I like to have the bias binding behind and the seam on top, so that when I trim the seam, if I was to accidentally cut, I'm going to cut into the bias binding, which is not such a big deal to replace, as opposed to cutting into the actual body of the blouse. That would be very boring. So I'm going to trim that off all the way around. Now I'm ready to finish off that bias binding. So I'm going to turn the blouse over, and starting at the centre back, I'm going to fold the seam allowance of the bias binding over so that it matches the stitching line, and then over again, and you can see I'm going to have a nice narrow bias binding. So I'm just going to sew that all the way around. So I just do a couple of stitches to get started and hold everything in place. And then I just open out. So I just sew short sections, about 10 centimetres at a time. I fold over about 10 centimetres ahead, and then just use my nail to tuck that seam allowance under. And I'm sewing right on the edge of this bias binding. When you get to that shoulder, just sort of mould the binding around the curve, and you'll find that that will sew beautifully. And carry on the whole way around the neck. And trim the threads. And so there is my bias binding from the inside, and on the outside it's lovely and neat. So I'm just going to give that a press. So I've pressed that neckline, and if I open this out, you can see I've got a beautiful curve around the shoulders, and I'm really happy with that. So now I'm going to sew the side seams. So I'm going to flip the back over the front, and matching up my side seams, I'm simply going to sew down one side and then back up the other. Chaining on to go back up the other side. Take it out. Now I'm going to overlock those side seams. So just as I chained on when I was sewing the side seams, I'm going to do the same when I overlock them. Cut those threads, and I'm now going to give that a press so that the seams face the back. The last bit of preparation I have to do for the top is to put the placket on for the elastic to go through. So first of all, I'm going to mark the centre back with a little snip on the fold, and then I'm going to mark the side seam. So I'm going to have a centimetre turnover on the centre front, and I can even just pop a pin in there to make that easy. So 1 centimetre turned over, and then if I line up that centre front with the centre back, I can then also snip those quarter points, which will be the side seam. Then I'm going to take my bodice, and I'm going to just draw a line actually where I want to sew this on. So I need to turn this under, but I actually want the seam to be concealed. So I'll grab a ruler. My finish, so I measured that out to be 6 centimetres. So my finished measurement needs to be 4. So I'm going to measure up 5 centimetres. So I've got my 1 centimetre there, the 4 centimetre width of the placket, and allowing for a turnover. Again, I'm going to use my friction pen, which disappears with heat mostly. Always check before you commit to something like this. And I'm going to measure up 5 centimetres, marking that at intervals, and then drawing a line. I'm going to do that all the way around the top. so there's my top. Now I'm going to place, wrapping that round a bit. So I've made a notch for my centre front. So I'm going to place this binding so that I have my 1 centimetre facing down and that my stitch line will be on that purple line that I've drawn. So I'm just going to take my pin out and pin that like so. Then I'm going to come around, and where I've got my 1/4 point notches on my waistband, so here I have the side seam and there I've got my side seam notch, overlapping by 1 centimetre. And then come around to the centre back where I have a notch on the blouse, and I match that notch, pop a pin in, coming around to the other side seam where my notch is, matching that up, 1 centimetre overlap, and then back to my centre front where I'm going to match those centre front openings together like so. The other thing I could have drawn actually was this seam allowance 4 centimetres up so that my cut edge was actually following along the drawn line, and that would be a better way of doing it if my fabric wasn't see-through like this one is. So I'm going to start sewing from the centre front, and I'm just going to sew the whole way round following that purple stitching line. And back to the centre front and snip those threads. There. Okay, so now I'm going to press this placket so that it faces down towards the waistband, and then I've got my nice little centre front opening. So there I have pressed my placket down, there's the little opening. Now I'm actually going to stay stitch around the bottom of this so that when I come to join it to the skirt, things aren't going to move around. And for me, I'm going to sew it on the wrong side because with my cheesecloth the crinkle is now going around the body, which is a nice design feature, but it means that when I pressed it, it actually sort of, the crinkles came out and it grew a little bit. So it's better for me to sew it on the wrong side and then trim off any excess. Trim those threads, and actually that wasn't too bad, there was just a little bit of overlap at the front. I'll just trim that off, not much. Okay, so there we have our top prepped and ready for the skirt. I'm going to start by sewing tier 1, so I'm going to open out 1/2, let's call it the back, and place the other half, let's call it the front, on top. Now I'm just going to sew down those side seams and then overlock them. Snip the threads and overlock. So, like before, down one side, back up the other. Snip the threads, and now I'm going to give those seams a press, and I'm going to press them towards the back. Now, according to my drawing, I want to have a row of lace on tier 1 when it joins onto tier 2, and on tier 2 when it joins onto tier 3. So I'm going to prepare tier 1. I'm going to overlock around the bottom edge in preparation for sewing on my lace. That's done. Now I'm going to sew on the lace. Now I'm going to sew on the lace. So I could cut the lace to size, but given that my fabric has a crinkle in it and it might stretch a bit, I just want to give myself a bit of leeway. So I'm going to sew the lace, so overlapping by 1 centimetre, just like we did for the centre front, setting my machine to a zigzag, so 2.5 and 2.5, and I'm just going to sew all the way around. Now I've come to the end of the seam, and I'm going to cut the lace so that I can just tuck it under 1 centimetre. I'm going to come to the end and back tack, lift the needle up and set my machine back to a straight stitch and just sew down to join that lace, like so. And that's not going to fray because I can see that this lace isn't that kind of fraying lace material. Okay, so now, like with the centre front, I'm going to turn the seam allowance back and I'm going to sew that all the way around with the seam allowance turned up. Snip those threads, and I'm just going to give that a press. So I'm going to show you a fun little way of creating this flounce on the second tier. So I have measured down 10 centimetres from the top of the tier and drawn a line all the way around the skirt in my invisible or disappearing pen, and then I have sewn the side seam from that marker point down to the hem on both sides. Next, what I'm going to do is snip the side seam up to that marker and the seam allowance on both sides. And then I'm going to turn it through to the right side, and then I'm going to bring that seam allowance over and sew down to the snip. So I'm going to do that on both sides. Because what's going to happen is this is going to fold over on that line that we've drawn to create a little sort of flouncy edge. So I need to finish this edge off. I could hem it if I wanted to, or what I'm going to do is just a narrow overlocked rolled hem sort of thing edge on there. So rather than doing a proper rolled edge hem, I'm just going to sort of fluke it with my machine. So I'm going to bring my lever forward and I'm going to shorten my stitch length to 2, and I'm just going to test that and see if I like how the stitch looks. Got a bit of scrap here, I'm going to have a look. I'm quite happy with that, but I'm just going to try increasing the tension on this red one. Yeah. I really like how that looks. So that's just sort of like a quick and dirty way of creating a pretty finish without actually changing over the needles and going through all that fuss, because I'm going to need to do more overlocking and I don't want to have to change that every time. So now I'm going to take tier 2 and I'm going to overlock on the top edge. So this is the inside with my drawn line, and there's my reversed seam. So I'm going to sew with that uppermost, so that's got the best edge. And I'm just going to go the whole way around. So here I am, back to the start. I'm going to over sew and just take that out. So your machine may behave differently. Like I say, play around with the settings and read your manual and just see what you can do on yours. Now I'm going to create some gathering along this line that I've drawn. Before I do that, I'm just going to mark my centre front and back again because I've overlocked my snips off. So I'm just going to pop a pin in. I could also maybe use my marker, but I'll do that as well in case the pin falls out, and mark that there. And then on the other side, the centre point. And the marker, like so. Okay, so I could use a gathering foot, but you can't really adjust them after you've gathered, so I find that to be a bit of a problem, so I prefer to do it manually. So I'm going to set my machine to its longest stitch, and I'm going to then sew all the way around, starting from the side seam. And I've actually got my foot lined up, the edge of my foot lined up with the purple line, because I do have that little bit of seam allowance and I'm not going to want that to show. So here we go, I'm going to go all the way around. And to the end. And then I'm going to pull it out and leave tails on my threads so I'll be able to pull them together. Now I'm going to sew a second row because that's the best way to get nice even gathers. And I'm going to sew that about 3 millimeters away from the first row. And take it out. Don't want it gathering yet. And leaving tails. Okay, so now I'm going to pull on the tails. Mostly, in theory, you're supposed to pull the threads from the bobbin to gather. Sometimes, depending on your machine, that may or may not work. So we're just going to slide the gathers along that line. So you want to have in the back of your mind sort of the measurement of your skirt. So if you recall, a quarter of my skirt was 27 centimeters, so I sort of want to kind of estimate it visually, and then I'll come back to it and even that out, but I don't want to over gather it. This is just, when you multiply it by 1.6, that's just a really soft, gentle gather. Okay, so before I gather it anymore, I want to start pinning that to tier 1. So here I have tier 2, the right way out, with the flounce rolling over, and you can see because I reversed the seam allowance, it's concealed on this side as well. And this is my side seam, and here is the side seam of tier 1, and that is actually going to go over the gather. So I'm just going to pop a pin in there at the side seam, and then I'm just going to work my way around. So I should have marked the quarter points on my tier 1. I can do that now. So pin in there, and a pin. Whoops, that fell out. Trouble with the holes on the lace. A pin in there. And there's a centre marker, and I'm going to pop the pin in the lace on top of there and pin it. I'm actually doing a sort of double pinning so it doesn't fall out of that lace. Coming around to the side, matching the side seam. So the side that's sitting on top, putting a pin in. And my double pin. And yep, the pin's fallen out of the other side, so just mark that quarter point. Like so. And match it with the centre point on tier 2. I'm doing a double pin. Okay, so now I can just tuck tier 1 inside tier 2 so I can see exactly what's going on. Give that a little shake so it's all inside. And now I can see how much extra I need to pull on my gathers, so I'm just going to fiddle around with that. And when I'm happy with it, I'm going to pop the lace on top, and I'm going to sew on that purple line that I've drawn. And don't forget to just set your machine back to a regular length stitch. And as you're sewing, just sort of slide your hand underneath just to make sure the gathers are nice and even and not sort of folded back on themselves at all. Coming back to where we started and over stitching, and trim off all those threads. And now if I give this a little flick, you can see I have this pretty lace insertion with a little flounce that's done all in one. So we're going to do exactly the same thing to tier 3, and I'm just going to give that a press before I go any further. So I think that looks just gorgeous now that it's pressed. So we're going to do the same thing on tier 2 to tier 3, but without the gathering this time. So if you haven't already, set your machine back, so flicking the switch, tension back to normal, stitch length back to normal, and we're just going to overlock on the right side the whole way around. Okay, so we're going to go back over to the sewing machine and sew the lace on. So once again, placing the lace over the fabric, and I'm just going to sew that on with a zigzag, so 2.5 and 2.5 all the way around. Coming up to the end, and I'm just going to cut off enough that I've just got a little bit of an overlap on that end. And take that out of the machine, set my machine to a straight stitch, and I'm going to just sew up the lace to close it off, making sure that the seam allowance is tucked under and back on itself so I can up to the top, pivot, and I'm just going to sew all the way around on my straight stitch, catching the seam allowance up to the body of the skirt. Back round to the end, snip the threads and just give that a little press. So the process for tier 3 is the same as for tier 2. You're going to draw a line that's 10 centimeters down from the top part, and you're going to sew the side seams up to your line. At that point you're going to snip into the seam, and we'll do that on both sides to where the line is. Then we're going to turn it through to the right side, bringing that seam over, matching the seam allowance, and we're just going to sew down to that snipping point. Now I'm just going to press those seam allowances to the back, but I want to be careful not to overpress so that my line doesn't disappear. Now I'm going to finish off tier 3, so I'm going to do my faux rolled hem on both ends this time, not just the top. So once again I'm going to set my machine to its fancy stitch, and I'm going to sew around the top and the bottom so that the pretty edge is on the right side. And there we go, both edges finished off. Now to sew it onto tier 2. So here's tier 3, the right side up, and tier 2, the right side up. And what I'm going to do is fold the flounce section over and place the lace on top and pop a pin in as a way of orientating myself. And I'm just going to do that double pin so it doesn't fall out, like so, and then I just tuck tier 3 underneath, and then I just come along and look for my center markers and overlapping the lace by a centimeter so I can see the purple line a centimeter under the lace, and pinning, coming around to the other side seam, placing the lace at the side seam to side seam, and pinning, and back to the last center point, keeping that flat and pinning. And now I'm just going to sew the lace to tier 3. So again I'm going to start from a side seam because that's just a neat position. So just flatten everything out, take the pin out. So I'm making sure that I've got that purple line, and I'm sewing a centimetre up on the lace so that my stitching line is going to be following that purple line, and we're just going to sew the whole way around. My bobbin ran out. Always happens just near the end. Quick change. The last 20 centimetres. And a little back tack. And take that out. So if I give that a little flick, can see we've then got our little doubly flounce hem. So I'm just going to give that a press. So I actually think this top and bottom would work really well as separates, but we're going to join them together. So here I have the skirt and it's the right way out, and I've got the top and I've turned it inside out. Now I'm going to tuck the skirt inside the top, and I'm going to match first of all the side seams, and then I'm going to match the center points. So pinning the sides, coming around to the other side seam, putting a pin in, giving that a little pull and snapping it into position so then I can see my center points, putting a pin in, and the last center point and popping a pin in. Now I'm going to sew all the way around, and I'm actually going to sew with the top on top of the bottom so that I can see where my placket seam is, and just make sure that I do keep that really nice and even. Now I'm going to overlock the waist seam, but this time I'm going to do this on the skirt side so that when I press the seam and it goes up, the nice side of the overlocking is showing. But this is just an aesthetic detail. Now I'm going to give that a press. So here we are, nearly done. All that's left is to hem the armholes. I'm going to do a 1 centimetre double fold all the way around because I just think that looks nice. Snip the threads and give that a press. The dress could be worn as it is, but we did talk about making some ties to put through. So here I've got my 2 torn strips connected at the selvage. So I'm just going to fold them right sides together and sew that selvage together. Trim those threads, and I'm just going to trim that seam as well to make it a little bit narrower. Next, I'm going to sew down the length of it. So right sides together, we're going to fold this in half, and we're just going to sew the whole way down. With this fabric, because it's got the crinkle in it and it's stretchy, I'm actually going to stretch it as I sew so that when I turn through, the stitching does not crack. Take it out of the machine and snip the threads. A few stray threads around there. Okay, now I'm going to get my rouleau turner and turn that through. So here I have my rouleau turner. This is my preferred method of turning things through. You just slide it in all the way to the other end. I like to actually rest it on my belly to keep it steady. When it comes out the other end, you just take this little hooky bit and you just push that through where the seam allowance is, and then allow it to hook over, and then pinch it between your finger and thumb to pull it back on itself. It can be a little tricky getting it started initially, but once you get the hang of this thing, it is so great. So there we go. And then the way I do it is I wrap my fingers around it, so 1, 2, 3, 4, hold it with my thumb and slide and pull. 1, 2, 3, 4, slide and pull, and I do that all the way until it comes out the end, even though that's gathering down there, because sometimes it does slip off, and I try to avoid that. Then I come back down to this end and just sort of start working that through again until so I can hold the bit that's turned through and just shuffle it down like so. Pull that through and through, shuffle it down, pull it through and shuffle. So depending on your material will affect how thin you can make this, or sometimes you might need to make it a bit thicker if your fabric isn't slippery. Sometimes it locks, so all you have to do is just slide the fabric up a bit and then just unlock that little bit and it will start to pull through again, in theory. And go like that. Locked again a bit. And I'm just going to give that a press. So here are my rouleaus all pressed. Now I could thread these through the placket now, but actually it sits better if you thread some elastic through first. So I'll pop that to one side. And here's some elastic that I've measured to fit comfortably around my waist, and I'm just going to use this little threading tool. You slide the ring up, clamp the clampers over the end of your elastic, slide the ring down, and that's nice and secure. Then we get the dress, and I'm just going to thread that through the channel. So you want to be careful not to twist the elastic as we're pulling it through. So I could have used wider elastic, this is just what I've got, but it will do the job to keep it the gathers nice and even. So just working my way around. This is a great little tool. You could use a safety pin, that would work just as well. But I just enjoy sewing tools. So we're going to leave a bit of an end. Don't want that to slide all the way through. Coming around and coming back up to the other end, and I'm just going to pull that out and just check that it's not twisted, and bring that end out and take my little tool off by sliding that ring. Now I'm going to overlap the two pieces of elastic, and I'm going to sew down one side, diagonally up, and down the other, so that it basically makes an N. Take that out and snip the threads. Now you can see the N shape, and just slide that in, and then just put your arms into the dress and just sort of give it a bit of a tug, and that will evenly disperse those gathers. Then we're going to take our waist tie and we're going to attach that to a little tool, and we're going to thread that around as well.
Around to the front. There it comes. Straighten it out so I've got twisted and rolled up.
Give that a pull. take the tulle off. And then I'm just going to slide this around. So it's quite a long tie. You can make it shorter. You can see what feels good when it's on. And if you want it to be shorter, you can simply cut it off. I'm just bringing that out and around. Then I'm just going to check to see if the ties are the same length, which they are not. Just sliding that up. And I can just pull it until they are the same length and then back on themselves. Just stretch it out again. Like that. A bit hard to see on my sewing table, but there you have the two ties coming out. So let's try it on. So here it is, my finished Maisie dress. Had to have 3 tiers in the skirt and with some fancy sewing details like lace insertion in the top, in the skirt, and this really cool little flounce detail. I've got the elasticated waist with my drawstring ties, and I just think it looks so sweet. It's got a lot of volume in the top so that it blouses. If you didn't like that, you can always shorten the top as well. You could also forego the waist ties and just have the elastic to keep the gathers even, because it looks really great worn with a belt as well. So what do you reckon? I can't wait to see what you make, so don't forget, tag me at Pattern Union, #MaisieDress. This is just a little footnote for the end. I actually managed to find some 4cm wide elastic to thread through my waist channel, and I think that looks much better than the one that didn't fit very snugly. In addition, I top stitched at top and bottom, leaving a channel for the drawstring to thread through. So this way the elastic isn't going to twist when I take the dress off and on, and it holds everything nice and flat, so I'm really happy with that.